I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker for 2017, Debraj, who is a Julius Silver Professor, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Professor of Economics at New York University, and one of the leading development economists in the world. And I invite Jean-Guillaume Foran to introduce our speaker in more detail. Thank you.
Hi there. So we're thrilled to be hosting Professor Debraj for this iteration of the Waterloo Arts Distinguished Lecture in Economics. And so Professor Ray's research interests are remarkably broad, and he's had contributions in so many areas of economics that it's difficult to give a bird's eye view of his accomplishments. So let me start by saying that Professor Ray is an economic theorist, and the role of economic theory is to develop models, that try to capture economic and social behavior, right? So now models can be useful for two reasons. They can be useful because they give us insight into specific applied economic or social issues, right? Models can also be useful if they serve as a foundation for the construction of other models that then in turn can be applied to study specific issues, right? And so Professor Ray's work has consistently been very useful, and it's been useful in the two ways that I've just explained, right? So let me give you two examples. So some of Professor Ray's work has been critical in showing us how to integrate the formation of groups or coalitions into our models of strategic decision making. So this is a foundational topic for game theory, and game theory is one of the key tools of modern economics. Professor Ray has also been involved in applying these new tools to specific problems. So for example, he studied the effect of coalition formation on what are called self-enforcing agreements. So those types of agreements between individuals or groups that don't rely on explicit, legally enforced contracts, but instead on implicit norms like reciprocity. So another example, some of Professor Ray's work has been important in showing us how to integrate altruism into our dynamic models of markets, of economic markets. And so this is also quite useful because, for example, parents make a lot of very important economic decisions with the future well-being of their children in mind. And in some recent work that's very interesting, Professor Ray has shown us how to include parents' aspirations for their children in these types of models. And so in doing so, he's shown us how these parental aspirations, and whether they're met or they're frustrated, can actually have real economic impacts. So I've just given you sort of two areas in which Professor Ray's work has been very influential in our discipline. I'm leaving out many, and I haven't said anything about social conflict or economic development, which is the topic of today's lecture, and in which, not surprisingly, sort of Professor Ray's work is at the forefront of what our discipline can offer. Right? So, but that's why he's here, and so I'll leave him to that. Yeah.
Okay, I go for an hour, right? Yeah. Can you guys hear me? I usually tend to shout. Anyway, by the way, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It was fascinating learning about my own work. I had not quite seen it from that point of view. In any case, here we are. I want to talk about uneven growth and social conflict. I want to start by talking a little bit about what I call the development treadmill, right? And I want to put up for you a cryptic set of numbers, and you can think about what these numbers might be. Well, I'll put you out of your suspenseful misery straight away by telling you that these are what are called doubling times for a country's per capita income. And these are for all the leaders that we've known going back several hundred years. So the Netherlands was the world leader for many years. Its income was doubling once every 350 years. Yeah? The United Kingdom, and this includes, by the way, the period of the Industrial Revolution, when you would have thought that all economic hell had broken loose, right? And things would be multiplying rapidly. Well, it still had a doubling time of 150 years. And you see, as we go down this list, the United States, you know, the usual 2% rate of growth, so that would give you a doubling time every 50 years or so, which sped up in the mid-20th century, but is back to that. And then Latin America in the 1960s, doubling time of 18 years. Korea in the 60s and 70s, a doubling time of 11 years. And then, of course, wonder of wonders, right? China, since 1980, has been doubling every 7 to 9 years. Okay? It's an astonishing change in the way the world is made up. Not just the spread of information, but the rate at which that information is coming. Right? Now, on top of this, this is why I call it the treadmill, right? Because it's a slope, right, against which we measure our deepest economic desires and inspirations and frustrations, right? But on top of that, I want to add uneven growth to this slopey treadmill, right? And you can think of many reasons, I'm not going to talk about them today, for why we have uneven growth in our society. But here are the usual suspects, right? So there could be technical change, and as we all know, that technical change leads to sudden jumps in inequality, which then slowly get eroded as people go into those sectors. But then there's a new jump, right? And we keep going. There's the great structural transformations of the world from agriculture to industry. That was the only one we knew about until the late 20th century came along, right? And then we've seen other structural transformations, like, of course, in information technology. Then there's been globalization, right? So globalization invariably leads to specialization of different kinds in subsets of commodities, as a result of which there's a lot of unevenness within each country, right? And finally, of course, on top of all of this, one can add the rent-seeking and the lobbying and the corruption that goes along with the development process. I'm not trying to put it forward as sort of an organic, natural way of things, but it is part of life, right, in developing countries. So when you have these astonishingly high rates of growth, coupled with the unevenness in this rate of growth, you might wonder what would be the reactions that we would see in such societies, right? So I've listed some of the reactions that we might have. The first and the most natural reaction that we all talk about when we think about economics is people changing their occupations, or people's children changing their occupations away from what their parents had, right? But as you might imagine, occupational choice is a slow process. It's an imprecise process. Why is it imprecise? Because by the time you get to wherever you think you want to go, the world has moved on, right? And finally, it's an intergenerational process, right? So it's great that my daughter is going to become a software engineer, but I want something in the here and now to make my life better. Right? So occupational choice, which is the mainstay, the workhorse of economic reactions to uneven growth, is woefully slow. Right? Then there's, of course, cross-sector percolation, the standard idea being that if there's a call center set up, well, the guy selling tea on the roadside stall, right, is going to benefit simply because there's going to be demand effects that go from people working in the call center to people buying tea, right? But so these percolations do help, but again, these are quite inadequate in the larger scheme of things. So that very naturally, and I'm of course collapsing maybe an entire PhD course into 2 minutes here, right? But it is not surprising in the light of all of this that you might think that political economy is one of the main ways in which these reactions to uneven growth occurs. Okay? So now political economy splits into two kinds, right? There's the kind that we've been genteelly brought up on: referenda, voting, lobbying, protests, right? Peaceful protests. And then there's the violent kind, right? And the violent kind is the kind that I want to talk about because it takes place entirely outside the ambit of the market system. Okay? But I want to kind of tie it up with this sort of unequal development that's been taking place. Okay? So that's my talk today. Right? That's the background. Now, so viewed from the point of view of political economy and frustration and violence and so forth, it's it's not hard to understand why people might feel so strongly about it, okay? The lives of others around you are profoundly on display, okay? They're on display because of the rise of information technology, and they're on display because they're also changing so fast, right? So as a result, it's not surprising, and this is the work on aspirations that was alluded to earlier, it's not surprising that our aspirations and our frustrations are all socially generated. Okay? They're socially generated, they're not just generated by absolute changes in our well-being, but by relative changes in our well-being. Right? And it's interesting, but it's kind of unclear whether this sort of exposure, right, socially, leads to betterment or it leads to a deep sense of frustration and despair. Right? And I want to tell you about a little story. This is a story called, known as Albert Hirschman's tunnel, right? It has very little to do with a tunnel, but still, names stick, right? But it has a lot to do with Albert Hirschman, who was one of the great social scientists of the 20th century, right? I should not insult him by calling him an economist, right? He was a much broader person than that. Anyway, Hirschman made the argument that all countries have a honeymoon period when their governments come to power. And the reason is, he says, imagine that you're stuck in a horrific traffic jam. So I went to Google and pulled out the best traffic jam I could find, right? So this is from Cairo, but I guess I could have pulled one out from Calcutta, right, where I'm from. And so imagine you're stuck in this jam, right, up there, and then the lane next to you starts to move. So Hirschman's profound question is, does that make you feel good or bad, right? And I think, it's a very good question. I think it sort of summarizes a lot of these issues, right? So there's the informational aspect of the lane next to you moving, which suggests that your turn is going to come soon. And this laid the foundation for Hirschman's notion of a honeymoon, right? The honeymoon is that the society will be quite tolerant of inequality simply because it's a signal that stuff is going to happen for you. But when that stuff doesn't happen, then the same direction of movement, namely other lanes moving, can lead to a very, very different reaction. Yeah? So that's the parable of Hirschman's tunnel. And I want to illustrate this for you not the entire aspect of the tunnel, but part of it, by referring to the Indian general elections that took place in 2014. They were interesting elections because the ruling Congress-led party, the Alliance, was overwhelmingly defeated by the BJP-led alliance, right, which came to power in 2014. But what's interesting about it is that during that time, the ruling party, which lost, presided over perhaps the greatest period of sustained economic growth in India's history, right? It was really high. Okay, so here's a little quote. The previous term is one in which growth accelerated, Indians started saving and investing more, foreign investment came rushing in, and poverty declined sharply. But growth can also unleash powerful aspirations as well as frustrations, and political parties who can tap into these emotions reap the benefits. Okay? So it's a story about relativism. You would be perfectly happy, I assure you, living in the Netherlands or even in the United Kingdom and have your per capita income trot along at the healthy rate of 2% a year. You would be super happy because you would be doing better than most people, right? You would not be so happy if you were living in India and your per cap and your income was growing at 2% when people around you are growing at 10, 15, 20% a year, right? And this quote I just like this line because it's sort of so strong. It says, "It is this tiger of unfocused fury that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has sought to ride from Gujarat to New Delhi," right? So this was a commentary after the elections. And and you see a little bit of this, and now Modi is having his own hard time at the moment, right? And this is from just a couple of days from the Financial Times. I just took a quote, right? Which says that Mr. Modi's government, who is now tasting a little bit of the previous medicine that was administered, right, is increasingly anxious about India's economy after GDP growth from April to June quarter fell to just 5.7%. Okay. it brought growth levels nearly back to the doldrums, right, of the waning days of the previous government, 5.7%. Yeah? So this is the kind of world we are in, right, where 5.7% is a number for losers, right? Whereas in the last several hundred years, growth rates above 2% or 3% have rarely been seen. So it's with that background in mind that I want to tell you a little bit about social conflict in these countries. And I also want to pose for you questions to which I don't have a very clear answer, sort of paradoxes of certain kinds. So this is armed conflict in the post-colonial sort of, for many countries, so after the Second World War, let's say 1946 to 2015. And the important part of this diagram that I just want to show you is that this yellow blob is all conflicts within states, okay? Not across countries, but within countries, yeah? And just to give you an idea of the numbers, so if you look after World War II, there were 240, up to the turn of the century, there were 240 intrastate conflicts, right? If you look at battle deaths, they were of the order of 5 to 10 million, which is to be compared to 3 to 8 million for interstate conflicts. Yeah? And this is not counting, you know, the mass assassination of civilians, right, which is in the order of tens of millions, or the displacement of people, right? So in 2015 alone, there were 29 of these ongoing internal conflicts going on, right? So another interesting thing about these conflicts, so it's this one picture about the market economy, right, which is doing fine, I guess, uneven but fine overall. But there's this other picture, right, of violence, stuff seething just under the surface, right? And in fact, the other interesting thing about this, and this is where the paradoxes start to appear, is that the majority of these conflicts have been classified as ethnic conflicts. Conflicts across religious groups or ethnicity in the narrow sense of the term, or across caste and so forth, right? And in fact, Jim Furin, who's a political scientist at Stanford, a wonderful political scientist, has actually classified ethnic groups working off earlier stuff done in the Soviet Union. And of 700 known ethnic groups, over 100 of them have been actively engaged in violence. Yeah? And I keep calling it a paradox, and you'll see why in a second, but it's so strong that political scientists have referred to this as the eclipse of the right-left ideological axis, which is the typical axis along which we think that conflicts are supposed to happen, between the haves and the have-nots. Okay? These are between the haves and the haves, or the have-nots and the have-nots, okay? But they're not between the haves and the have-nots. Yeah? And Donald Horowitz summarized this by saying, in much of Asia and Africa, it is only modest hyperbole to assert that the Marxian prophecy has had an ethnic fulfillment, which I think is one of the great questions of political economy. Why is it that faced with substantial inequality vertically, do people lash out sideways? Okay? And I think that gives rise to an entire research agenda. So this is why, so to summarize, I think ethnicity or class, this whole business when people react. Now, by the way, I realize some of you are thinking, well, he was just talking about economics, now he's just changing. Well, I'm going to come back and put the economics and the ethnicity together, but you'll have to bear with me until the end of my talk, okay? But the story will fit, okay? So this question is one, as I said, one of the great questions of political economy, right? It isn't that the Marxian view is totally irrelevant, right? We have Sendero Luminoso in Peru, we have Naxalite violence in India, so it's not like it's completely irrelevant, right? But if you think about it, if you think that you were in a world where you had not been influenced by Marx, and like it or not, we've all been influenced by him, right? Imagine a world where Marx didn't exist, and you were to ask, who would fight whom? Would people who are very different fight each other? Or would people who are very similar fight each other, right? And I think that the jury is out on that question. And I think it's very reasonable to suggest that economic similarity can matter very strongly for conflict. Yeah? Because it's those guys who are competing in the same jobs as you are, right? It's those guys who are running the same businesses as you are, right? So there's a very natural reason why people should want to lash out at people who are similar to them, okay? But of course, lashing out in this completely chaotic, crazy fashion is not going to get anybody anywhere, right? So there's room here for a political entrepreneur to create markers saying, you guys are natives, those guys are immigrants, you guys are Hindus, those guys are Muslims, you guys are Sinhala, those guys are Tamil, right? And these markers, what they help to achieve is to take people who are actually economically quite similar and create divisions among them. Of course, now, this is not some kind of nasty story that these markers never had any value to start with. Of course, they were, something was there, right? But those come to the forefront, they're brought to the forefront by actual economic necessity, by reasons of exclusion rather than redistribution. And we see that usually that conflict is usually over these directly contested resources, right? Government quotas for jobs, or land, right? Or businesses and so forth. So as I said, the implications of this direct contestation, so even if you were an economist, you would be seeing a picture where it looks like reasonably similar groups economically are having a grand fight across each other. At that point, an economist could say, okay, I wash my hands of this. I don't understand this. Okay, I could just say, so I just see ethnicity at work, religion at work. I don't see economics at work, right? And in fact, people like Samuel Huntington have argued just that, right? When they talk about the clash of civilizations, they're saying that the great conflicts of this world are not economic. The great conflicts of this world are ethnic, right? But you could look at the very same picture and draw not what is called a primordial view, which is the Huntington view, right? But you could draw an instrumental view, which is that there are these jobs. We need to get half these people excluded from the jobs. Let's call them immigrants. Let's call them Muslims, or let's use those markers as a way of excluding. Okay? That's just as economic as anything else, except it doesn't look economic. Now, you might say, well, that's just an assertion, Debraj. You could say that that's a view of things. What's the evidence for that? So if you hold off for a little while, I'm going to come back to this question of evidence that economics really does matter over here. Okay? But it's harder to see, simply because the people involved are economically similar. Yeah? Okay, so one might ask, why is ethnicity salient in this world when there's so many other obvious cleavages, right? So there's several reasons. One, we've just talked about this, the immediacy of gains, the value of direct exclusion. Okay. Now, by the way, I want you guys to have Brexit and the United States in your mind, even though I'm not directly talking about it. I'm not directly talking about it because I don't have much to add to that story, right? Everybody knows about it. What I want to do, and this is what I told Francisco when he asked me to come and talk here, is that I want to tell you the story from the point of view of developing countries. And you draw the parallels. You think about the parallels, whether they fit or not. So, as I said, redistribution is a far more indirect object than raw exclusion. Okay, that was the first point. The second point is that ethnicity is recognizable. In many situations, they're recognizable, right? So, this by itself creates a reason for conflict across ethnic groups. So, here is an interesting quotation from Dabik, which is the English language magazine of ISIS, right? Which you can get on the web. You can just go on the web and read different issues of Dabik. It's quite interesting, right? And this is a strategy which is posted on Dabik, right? Which they talk about the gray zone. Now, what's the gray zone? The gray zone is the zone in which the Muslims of France and England and India live. They live in mainstream society. They live a mainstream life. They live a life like anybody else, right? But they want, the Islamic State policy is to attack the gray zone. Okay? The attack the gray zone, how do you attack the gray zone? What you do is carry out an act of horrific violence, which will then cause other people to recognize Muslims as outsiders and push them out of mainstream society. And the objective, the directly stated objective of the Islamic State is to actually take mainstream Muslims, push them out of mainstream society, right, so that they will fall into the arms of the Islamic State, right? So this is, people are writing papers on this, but this is explicitly stated, right? So the gray zone is critically endangered. Rather, on the brink of extinction, Muslims in the Crusader countries will find themselves driven to abandon their homes for a place to live in the Khilafat as the Crusaders increase persecution against Muslims living in Western lands. Right? So recognition is an important part of this ethnicity story. The third is that in many developing countries, our institutions, like also in developed countries, I guess, our institutions like fiscal progressivity, right, progressive taxation, it's all set up to cater to economic inequality. Maybe doesn't cater very well, okay, but at least on paper, institutions are set up to deal with economic inequality. There are no institutions set up to deal with ethnic inequality. Okay? So for example, in India, where we've inherited our colonial laws from the British, we have fabulous progressive tax rules and so forth. They may not work very well, but it's all there. Okay? It's focal. And so when that is focal, you can have a caste group come up and say, hey, what about us? Or the Hindus rise up and say, hey, what about us? That's another cleavage that has gone ignored. So that's another reason. Colonial institutions focus on class, and by doing so, they raise the specter of other divisions which have not been adequately considered. Right? The fourth reason why ethnicity may be salient, I'm going to talk about a couple of these using the data, but just to give you an idea, is this idea of motive versus means. Okay? And put in a sentence, one way you can say is that, class conflict, which is the sort of natural way in which Marx or all of us would think about conflict, is a two-edged sword, right? So you can think of the poor having all the motive, but they don't have the means, right? And the rich have all the means, but they don't have the motive, right? So the poor feel all the resentment, but what they're going to do with that resentment? Okay, now very often we see the great, think of Occupy, right? Think of the Occupy movement. All the motive was on one side. But Occupy died out because it just did not receive adequate funding. Yeah? Now what is interesting about ethnic violence is that on each side of this divide, when you think of Protestant Catholic violence for that matter, right? On each side of that divide are people who have both money to spare and people who both have their bodies to spare, right? So this synergy of that the rich can give money and the poor can give their labor, right, into conflict can be exploited, okay? So you will see some evidence of this later on in this talk when I discuss the data a little bit more. So as I said, ethnic division gives rise to this perverse synergy of money and labor. Think about, for example, why the United States doesn't need a military draft anymore, right? It doesn't need a military draft anymore because there's enough people to provide labor and there's enough people to provide money and look the other way, right? And so you can have actually a market equilibrium where enough people join the military. With low inequality, you would not have that. Yeah? You would have to then have a draft. And the final point I want to make about ethnic salience is that it gives rise to what I call the ambiguity of inequality, okay? Which is that, and this is a theme I'm going to come back to at the end of the talk, which is that economic inequality has ambiguous effects on the incidence of violence. An increase in income of a rival group creates a greater incentive to carry out violence against that group. But an increase in income of your own group, the one that's perpetrating the violence, actually decreases the incentive for violence. It decreases the incentive for violence because you simply have a larger opportunity cost of waging that violence. Okay? So income increases can both be violence-inducing and violence-reducing depending on which group is suffering or enjoying that income increase. Okay? So these are 5 points that I wanted to make about ethnic salience, right? Why ethnicity might be salience. Now, having made all these points, I realize that I haven't given you a single piece of serious data, right? So this, I wanted to start by giving you this overall picture. And now I want to ask the question of whether there's, I'm going to leave out that last bit. I'm going to talk about it tomorrow, though. That's my topic for tomorrow's talk, multiple markers, okay? But I'm going to leave that out. And I'm going to go to the data straight away and ask, look, now we've discussed several of these things from maybe an ethnographic viewpoint that, well, we do know that ethnicity is very important in conflict. But is it true that if you take a country that's ethnically divided, that it's more prone to conflict? Is it true? Do we see that in the data? Okay. Now, the first question that should come to your mind when that issue is addressed is, well, what's a division? Okay. Well, fortunately, or unfortunately, as you will see in a minute, but fortunately for now, right, we do have a measure of ethnic divisions that goes back to a wonderful publication from the Soviet Union called the Atlas Narodov Mira. Okay? The Atlas Narodov Mira actually published measures of ethnic diversity in each country. And the way they do it, just a couple of equations, please, I'm sorry. I hope I will not offend your sensibilities too much. But what the Atlas Narodov Mira does is create a measure of the following kind. So imagine that there's a bunch of groups in society, and the share of group I is Ni, and you want to ask the question, what's the probability? So imagine this is society. What's the probability if I draw two of you at random that you'll belong to two different ethnicities? And this little formula, which any of you who is slightly mathematically minded can figure out the answer instantly, this little formula gives you that answer. It's the probability that if I draw two persons at random from this room, that they will belong to two different ethnic groups. Okay? And you can think of that as a measure of how diverse, how ethnically divided a society is. Okay? So if there's a measure hanging around on top of a shelf, the first thing that an economist or a political scientist will do is reach for it, okay? And in fact, that's what they've done, right? So there's been a number of studies, as you can see, I've quoted several of them over here, that have actually tried to relate this notion of group division to ethnic violence. But here's the odd thing. You don't see a relationship between this measure and conflict. So I've just gone on telling you that ethnographically there's so much ethnic violence, and that's true, right? But it doesn't appear to be a case that countries which are more fractionalized in this sense are more prone to violence, okay? And here's a summary from Fearon and Layton. They say, the estimates for the effect of ethnic and religious fractionalization are substantively and statistically insignificant. The empirical pattern is thus inconsistent with the common expectation that ethnic diversity is a major and direct cause of violence. Okay. Well, what happened? Okay. Well, now here is the one and only point where I want to tell you, or maybe one of 2 points that I tell you, that economic theory matters. Okay, and I'm going to tell you that. So my question as a theorist would be, fine. But just because that measure existed in the erstwhile Soviet Union, why did we use that as a measure? Why is that a valid measure? Right? And I want to give you a reason for why it's not a valid measure. And this reason comes actually from the anthropologist Donald Horowitz, who I referred to before. And it's hidden in this sentence. It's in English, not in math, right? But it's hidden in there, okay? It says, in dispersed systems, group loyalties are parochial and ethnic conflict is localized. A centrally focused system with few groupings possesses fewer cleavages than a dispersed system, but those it possesses run through the whole society and are of greater magnitude. Okay? Does fractionalization pick that up? And the answer is no, but to do that, you have to do a little bit of theory, okay? What fractionalization is picking up is diversity. Lots of little cleavages. Increase the number of cleavages, the fractionalization measure will go up. But what Horowitz is kind of trying to grope towards is a measure of what one might call polarization, okay? Which is different from having lots of little groups, but the question of whether you have 2 or 3 groups engaged in systemic opposition to each other, right? So, so just to summarize that point, if you think about deep cleavages and fractionalization, no, this measure generally increases with the number of different groups in society. So as a result of that, one has to revisit this empirical exercise using a measure of polarization. Now, fortunately, and this is really fortuitous, in 1994, Joan Esteban, my good friend and colleague, and I had actually written a complete, just a theory paper. At that point, we were not even interested in ethnic violence. We had not much of a clue about it, right? But we wrote a paper called On the Measurement of Polarization, so in 1994, and we decided, well, why not try to bring this object and look at the data with it? Okay? But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about why this object, which I'm going to define for you in a second, does a better job in picking up deep cleavages rather than small groupings. Okay? So the idea that we worked with in our 1994 paper is the idea that we want to measure a situation in which society is divided into groups. There's a lot of homogeneity within each group, and there's a lot of heterogeneity across groups. So we call this the sort of identity alienation framework, right? And now, because I'm old, I am allowed to quote from myself, okay? I would not have attempted this 20 years ago, but now I will. So this is what we wrote. When we wrote this, even though we did not have a clue about the data, okay? We begin with the obvious question, why are we interested in polarization? And then we argued, completely without any factual basis, okay, that it is our contention that the phenomenon of polarization is closely linked to the generation of tensions, blah, 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 to the possibilities of articulated rebellion and revolt, and to the existence of social unrest in general, okay? So the measure that we came out with looks a lot like the fractionalization index, but since this is not a talk in math, okay, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what it does is that it pays attention to group size, okay? And because it pays attention to group size, it behaves very differently from a measure of fractionalization. Sometimes it agrees. I'll give you an example. A society which is completely homogeneous, split it into 2, fractionalization will go up, and polarization will go up. So it's not that it always disagrees. But if you keep splitting, fractionalization will continue to go up, but polarization will start to fall. Yeah? So this is a little diagram where I've just plotted for you what happens if you imagine a society which is equally divided into many groups. The blue line tells you that the fractionalization measure just keeps rising as you have more and more groups. The polarization measure initially rises, as I just told you a few seconds ago, and then falls. Okay? So these are 2 different measures. They're not diametrically opposite measures, but they're different. Yeah? And what we did in our subsequent work was to actually show why, from a game theoretic point of view, why polarization should have an effect on conflict in economies as well as fractionalization. Okay? And I'm not going to tell you much about this except to say that, except to tell you a little bit about the kinds of conflict that we were thinking about. So we were thinking about 2 kinds of conflict. You can think of conflict which is over private goods, like grabbing oil revenues, yeah? Or you can think about conflict over public goods, such as getting political power. And we argued that polarization is germane and very important to conflicts over public goods, and fractionalization is very important in thinking about conflict over private goods. Now, when you ignore this distinction and lump everything together and only look at fractionalization, what it's doing is that there's one measure, one poor measure, fractionalization, desperately trying to do double duty to handle both of these effects, and it all goes out of the wash and you get 0 effect. But when you separate out fractionalization from polarization and actually correlate both of these with conflict, you start getting strong effects. Okay? So the result is that, as I said, for large populations, conflict is approximately proportional to a combination of polarization and fractionalization, where the combination is determined by how public the conflict is. The more public it is, the more polarization should matter. The more private it is, the more fractionalization should matter. Now, what I want to show you is that this is actually seen in the data. Okay, so this is going to answer our first question about why ethnicity is so important and why it plays such an important role in determining conflict. Okay? So what we did was, this was joint work with Laura Mayoral and Joan Esteban. We took 138 countries over 1960 to 2008. Okay? And we looked at a measure of conflict which has been developed by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. Okay? That's why it's called PRIO. They have a variety of measures. I don't have time, and I don't think we'll have the patience to go into how all of this stuff is measured. But just to give you some idea, the PRIO, Peace Research Institute of Oslo, has as its baseline this idea that there is an ethnic conflict or any kind of conflict in progress in a country if that conflict generates 25 or more battle deaths in a year. Okay? And then they have other measures, 100, 1,000, and so forth. Some conflicts, by the way, which are extremely important, don't get picked up by this. For example, Basque violence. We all know about Basque violence. But Basque violence does not kill 25 people a year every day. It's the threat of that violence, right? It's the threat of that division which is important. So PRIO is not perfect, but it does pick up a lot of these. And then we use Jim Fearon's database on culturally distinct groups in 160 countries. And we also use this wonderful database called Ethnologue. I wish I had more time to tell you about. So it's a linguistics database talking about languages spoken by all these different groups. And what you can do with with this linguistic database is you can use these to form notions of distance across groups by using how far away they are linguistically on the language tree, right? So for example, all Indo-European languages lie in the same common subtree, and Spanish and Basque sort of diverge at the first branch, and Spanish and Catalan stay close together, even though at the moment they're not. But anyway, that's another story, right? But in any case, you can use this to construct distances across groups, and then apply our measure, right? And econometricians typically also like to have a bunch of controls so that to make sure that other stuff is not confounding the picture, right? So we have population and GDP per capita, dependence on oil, the nature of the terrain, and so forth. Okay, I'm going to leave out this slide. This is just to show what the regression. I want to spend some time on this though. Okay, so what this does is that each column over here is a different regression. And what each regression is doing is it's taking conflict as a dependent variable, okay, and try to connect it to a bunch of independent variables, right? Namely polarization, fractionalization, and then a whole bunch of controls. And what these regressions do is they traverse the spectrum from controlling for very little, just looking at polarization, fractionalization, and the population. That's what the first column does, right? To hitting it with the entire kitchen sink of all the controls that you can think of. Right? So controlling for democracy, controlling for non-contiguous terrain, and so forth. But what's dramatic about this table is that when you enter both polarization and fractionalization, not fractionalization alone, but you enter both of them in, they are highly positive and significant in determining conflict. Okay? And this is across our group of 138 countries. Now, when I say highly positive, the econometricians among you say, well, slow down. Those coefficients don't mean a thing at the moment, okay? Significance, yes, you can see that these numbers are significant. So let me say a word about size, right? So these numbers are not just significant in the statistical sense, they're big, okay? And what I mean by that is the following. If you were to hypothetically take a country and move it from the 20th percentile of polarization to the 80th percentile of polarization in the country distribution, then conflict is predicted to double, right, according to this regression. So it's a strong effect. But what's equally interesting is that if you move a country from the 20th percentile of fractionalization to the 80th percentile of fractionalization, conflict is also predicted to double. And why I'm saying it's interesting is because if you left out that P measure and just ran it, the same regression with the F measure alone, you'd get nothing. Okay? And the reason you get nothing is, as I said, the F measure would be desperately trying to do double duty for this omitted measure, for this omitted variable, which we put back into the picture. So then, the rest of this work that we do, which I'm of course not going to go into the details on, try to look at many variations on this, right? We do several variations, and what's interesting about it is that this effect sticks, right? This the polarization and fractionalization continue to be positive and robust. I won't tell you about any of these variations, but I'm going to mention just one of them, okay? And just mention one of them because I think it goes back to this idea of publicness versus privateness. What you can do from the data is that you can construct measures of how public a country's potential conflict is. And the way you do that is by looking at mineral reserves, notably oil, right, in different countries. And you can use this to form an estimate of if a conflict were to break out in a country, how likely is it that that conflict would be of a private goods nature, grabbing oil revenues, rather than of a public goods nature, grabbing control of power. Okay? And when you form that measure, which I'm not going to tell you about in detail, but it's up here, okay? When you form that measure and you run the same regression again, and now I'm going to tell you how we run this regression. You run it the same way. There's a whole bunch of controls. So the other stands for yes, it's a big regression, but I've truncated it to put you out of your misery here, right? And I've got P and F in there just as before, polarization and fractionalization. And what I've done is I've multiplied the polarization measure by our estimated value of publicness. By the way, if you're interested more in this, come to my economics talk tomorrow where I'll talk about this in more detail, okay? But I multiplied it by our estimated value of publicness, and I multiplied the fractionalization measure just as the theory told me to do, right? By the amount of privateness in potential conflict, okay? So we are following the theory. And if you follow the theory, something interesting happens. The polarization and fractionalization measures on their own switch off. They are no longer significant. But the polarization measure interacted with publicness becomes significant. The fractionalization measure interacted with privateness becomes significant, which is to suggest a little bit more than what I said in the previous regression, that P and F matter. This regression says that P and F matter in a particular way through a particular channel, okay? which this regression talks about. Okay. So, how much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Very good, okay. So that was one part of it, okay, which had to do with ethnicity. So I talked about ethnicity in some detail. Then just to summarize, I tried to argue that ethnicity plays a big role in conflict, okay? That was the one-line summary of all of that. But hey, I'm an economist. We want to go back to the economics issues, okay? So we want to talk about what about ethnicity and economics, okay? So what about economic inequality? Our first obvious suspect, right? That's the one which Marx would say, go look at that first, you know? So let's look at it. Now, in fact, there are great economists who have looked at it. So Amartya Sen is one of them, who haven't actually looked at it, but have made the point that the relationship between inequality and rebellion is indeed a close one, and it runs both ways. Unfortunately, he looked at it, and it was a commonsensical statement to make, but it's not true. This is not true. And I was so surprised many years ago when I first saw this data that I couldn't believe it. I had to run my own regression to find out, which I'll tell you about in a second. But here's a survey by a guy called Lichtbach of 43 papers on the subject. He calls some of them "some best forgotten." Terrible, but anyway, I couldn't help putting that up, right? And anyway, the summary by Midlaski of some of this stuff is, there's a fairly typical finding of a weak, barely significant relationship between economic inequality and political violence. Rarely is there a robust relationship between the two variables. And as I said, I was so taken aback by this that I asked Laura and another colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, Oindrila Dubé, and Oindrila, Joan, Laura, and I ran a regression. We took the Prio measures and we hit it with a modern day parallel regression. So this is back in 1989. And so this is what we ran. So the Gini coefficient is a familiar measure of inequality. Okay? And we regressed different measures of Prio conflict on the Gini coefficient. For those of you who are interested, this was a panel, so we had country fixed effects. We're just working off variations in inequality. But anyway, okay. And, you know, you get negative numbers as often as you get positive numbers. These numbers are small, actually, but they're negative as well as positive. Sometimes inequality is negatively associated with conflict. Okay. That's weird. Okay. But it's not so weird, hopefully, if you've been slightly brainwashed by the start of my lecture, which is where I was trying to argue that inequality is not really at the heart of it. It's unevenness, and this is a theme that I'm going to come back to right at the very end. Okay? So as I said, not surprising, recall the earlier discussion that we had of ethnic salience. I want to just take 2 points from that discussion and put them up again just for you to recap, right? One was motive versus means, right? That the class marker is a two-edged sword. Remember that one? That the poor have the motive but not the means, blah, blah, blah. That suggests that inequality a priori could have a low correlation with violence. The other was the ambiguity of inequality, that when the rival group's income goes up, you want to attack. When your group income is going up, the opportunity cost of violence goes up, and therefore you want to attack less, right? So this suggests that inequality should have a somewhat ambiguous role to play. But of course, if that were all, we could just shut up shop and go home. We want to go a little bit more than that. In both of these statements, we are saying that inequality is ambiguous, but we are also saying in the subtext that there is a particular way economics and ethnicity interact, right? For example, in the first one, I'm saying that there could be a perverse synergy of money and labor within groups. But what should that tell us? That should tell us that if you look at within group inequality, not across group inequality, but within group inequality, you should see a correlation with violence. Yeah? And in fact, you do see that in the data, right? So I'm going to just very quickly refer to that. I know you can't see all the numbers here, and I apologize for that, but I'll very quickly show you what the important things are. So this is a gigantic regression, right, which regresses violence on the Gini coefficient, which, as usual, is ambiguous. It doesn't affect anything. And on various measures of inequality across ethnic groups and within ethnic groups. Okay? And then there are controls. You know, the polarization and fraction. As usual, those guys continue to be significant, but that's not the main question that we're asking now, and a whole bunch of controls. Okay? What I want you to look at is that the Gini is insignificant. Between group inequality is insignificant, but within group inequality is strongly positively significant in determining violence. Okay? So it speaks to this idea that if you have a group with inequality within it, they can organize themselves better. It's a very paradoxical notion, right? Because it would suggest that a group should be economically similar. But actually, economic differences help because some people can give the money and other people can give the labor. So that's one. I hope this is a good example of what I mean by not just looking at inequality per se, but how inequality interacts with ethnicity, right? So, which is the example here. And I want to finish by talking about, so this is the last bit of my talk, I want to talk about the second point, the second recap, which has to do with the ambiguity of inequality. Okay? And this one, I think, is a topic worth pursuing in a lot of detail, except that I haven't done it. I will tell you what I have done, and which is an empirical study of Hindu-Muslim violence in India. Okay? So some of you might find this interesting intrinsically, and the others might find it interesting because of what it illustrates about the ambiguity of inequality. Okay? So this paper got me into a bit of trouble, but I'll tell you about that later. Okay? So Hindu-Muslim violence is endemic in India. Okay? It's been around ever since the partition of India into India and Pakistan, but even before that. Yeah? And one thing, a couple of things are suggested. Okay? So this is a case where usually we think of, in this world that we live in, we think of Islam as the bad guys. Well, in this case, it's the Hindus that are the potential bad guys, right? Well, part of the reason is that, nobody's genetically different, just depends on cultural situations. And in Indian history, and given the relative size of the Hindu population, they both suggest that, firstly, religion is a highly salient cleavage, and that Hindu groups are generally dominant in propagating conflict. This is not to say that, maybe if the Muslims had been in the majority, they would have been dominant. Okay, so this is not a big deal, but this is what is suggested by Indian history. Right? Question: does economics have anything to do with this? Okay, does economics have anything, or is this just Samuel Huntington at work? Yeah? Now, if you look at the ethnographic literature on Hindu-Muslim violence. Firstly, it's fascinating, okay? It's fascinating. But secondly, a lot of the ethnographic literature actually speaks to the economic nature of this violence, okay? So, for example, on Bombay riots, right, classified as a major land grab, right? Then what happens is, so here's another land grab example, but these ones, textiles, bidis, brassware, sari dealers, wholesale, silk, housing, not the last one, housing, but these other ones, are examples in which Hindus were dominant in a particular sector, let's say sari making or brassware, and Muslim groups came into that sector. They're identical economically, okay? They are Muslim rivals just like Hindu rivals, but there's a marker available, right? And as a result, there was a backlash against these groups, and these ethnographic studies talk about backlashes of this kind, right? The last one is again a land grab, it's a housing grab, right? So I'll give you one example from this from a journalist who died a few years ago, Asghar Ali Engineer, wonderful man, who wrote eloquently on Hindu-Muslim violence in India. And this is about the violence in Meerut, which took place I think in the late 80s, right? And he writes, if religious zeal is coupled with economic prosperity, as has happened in Meerut, it has a multiplying effect on the Hindu psyche. The ferocity with which business establishments have been destroyed in Meerut bears testimony to this observation. Entire rows of shops belonging to Muslims were reduced to ashes. Okay? And you see this in the Sikh violence after Indira Gandhi's assassination and so forth, right? So that's on one side, the ethnography, that there is maybe some economics going on here. Of what kind is entirely unclear at the moment, okay? And this is further clouded by the fact that if you look at leading scholars of, in political science or anthropology, when they're taking an overall picture, this is what they write. So here's Steve Wilkinson saying, despite the disparate impact of riots on Hindus and Muslims, however, little hard evidence suggests that Hindu merchants and financial interests are fomenting anti-Muslim riots for economic gain. Okay, so if you take an overall picture, not the fine points of ethnography, but just the overall picture, you see, it's not that he's saying it's not, he's just saying that there isn't evidence. Or Horowitz, right? The role that commercial competition is said to play is said to be a covert behind-the-scenes role which makes proof or disproof very difficult, right? So the econometrician in me, which I admit is not very substantial, okay, but at least the economist in me, right, was immediately provoked, what's going on here? Can we get a handle on this stuff, right? So what we did was we took this, 5? Very good, okay. 6 is infinitely better than 5. Okay, so what we did was we studied, here's something interesting about Hindu-Muslim violence. The government of India does not publish data on it. The government of India has very detailed data on violence of all kinds in India, but not on Hindu-Muslim violence, because it will not acknowledge that this is an issue worth pursuing. Yeah? And this is not just the current government, it's been going on for a while, right? However, these two intrepid scholars, Ashutosh Vashni and Steve Wilkinson, who I quoted a little while ago, they have actually put together a database, and if you guys are interested, I can tell you in the Q&A, from the Times of India, recording all instances of Hindu-Muslim, or what they call communal violence, right? Religious violence across these two groups. We don't know who the perpetrators are. We just know that there were Hindus and Muslims involved, right? And then, you know, I extended, Anirban Mitra and I extended this for another 4 years. That was a lot of work, but leaving that out. Okay, so that's the conflict stuff. And then we took our income data. Actually, it's not income data because India doesn't have good data on incomes. They have good data on expenditures. So to be precise, these are, but let's call them loosely income. This is income data from the National Sample Survey, which is an entirely orthogonal data set. Okay. And what we want to know is the following. Is there any truth to this assertion that when one group's income goes up, violence increases, and when another group income goes up, violence might decrease? Okay. So leave this page out. Recall this thing about rival income, which I just recalled, so I'll move on. And I want to just show you, I want to just end with 2 diagrams. I want to just show you 2 diagrams. So what each of these diagrams does is that it plots on the horizontal axis incomes or expenditures, as I told you, from the National Sample Survey. So in this case, it's Muslim per capita expenditures. Yeah? And on the vertical axis, it plots the incidence of violence by looking at all people who were killed and injured in riots, right, in particular regions of India. There are 55 regions of India that we look at. Each region in this diagram is represented by a single line. Each line in this diagram connects 3 dots. And these 3 dots are 3 different points of time. Okay? So in a word, this is even stronger than doing fixed effects. I'm just showing you what the raw data looks like, right? But these are region fixed effects, right? Finally, the data has been purged in one way. It's been purged of overall time trends. Okay? We've taken out overall time trends from this data. So this is, we've taken that treadmill and made it flat. So what you see, and I think it's quite interesting, that as Muslim incomes go up, violence goes up. Okay? It's very strong. You can almost see it region by region. And what's dramatic is its contrast with what happens when you change Hindu incomes, which is this, right? So when you change Hindu incomes, you get exactly the opposite effects on violence. Violence tends to come down. Now, the bit that got us into trouble, so we said 2 things. So the first thing we said, look, there's this very strong, we might discuss this more, why exactly is this happening and so forth, but there's a very strong connection between economics and violence, and religious violence. Okay? But more so, and this is the part that got us into trouble, that the Muslim graph slopes up and the Hindu graph slopes down. Now the theory tells us that a perpetrator group, if their income goes up, then they have less violence that they want to engage in, and therefore violence should come down. Whereas for a victim group, when their income goes up, you want to grab. Yeah? So we went a step further and we suggested that because the Muslim graph is upward sloping and the Hindu graph is downward sloping, this establishes that Hindus are the perpetrators of Hindu-Muslim violence in India, okay? For which I didn't even know that BJP trolls read the Journal of Political Economy, but they did. So then we got a few death threats, and then I wish I hadn't done this. But in any case, that's another story. I just wanted to tell you about this this bit here. Okay, this just shows you the negative effect of Hindu expenditure on violence and the positive effect of Muslim. Okay. I'm going to finish up. There were a couple of variations I wanted to talk about. I'll mention only one of them. I wanted to talk about endogeneity because there's a huge issue. Maybe I can do it in the Q&A. But I also wanted to show you a placebo test. A placebo test is, let's look at the same effects of Hindu and Muslim incomes on all violence in India. That's a placebo because our theory says that there should be no relationship, right? And indeed, so this is the endogeneity which I'm leaving out. If you run a placebo, right, then you get one, sporadic significant coefficient, but everything else is insignificant, okay? So it does really suggest that there's something going on in the economics of Hindu-Muslim violence as opposed to Hindu incomes affecting general violence or Muslim incomes affecting general violence. Okay, so I think this is a good point to stop. Okay, I'm right at the 1 hour point. Yeah. So let me summarize. I want to say that, I've talked about uneven growth, frustrated aspirations, and conflict, but our starting point has always been contestation across similar groups, right? And what I've tried to argue is that ethnic divisions can be highly salient in such situations. And the notion of us and them are profoundly contextual, right? How we create markers and differences across people. Direct contestability of this kind creates antagonism across similar groups, right? And non-class conflict, including ethnic conflict, may well be focal. And I think that this question of salience is fundamental to thinking about conflict. As I said, it's instrumentalism as opposed to primordialism. Right? And certainly much more research is needed on the interaction between economics and ethnicity. And I've tried to illustrate a strong connection using Hindu-Muslim violence. But in this strong connection, notice that Muslim groups are somewhat poorer than Hindu groups in India. They're somewhat poorer. Not much poorer, but they're somewhat poorer. So when Muslim income's going up forbids more violence, you're getting, what are you getting? You're getting an increase, a decrease in inequality causing violence. When Hindu incomes go up and you get less violence, you're getting an increase in cross-group inequality causing less violence. So you see the relationship between inequality and violence is a very complex issue. It's not just taking your favorite measure of economic inequality and slapping it on the right-hand side of a regression. Okay? It's to look carefully at the interaction between ethnicity and violence. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a bit of time left over for questions. So the way it has to work is that you shout them out, and I do my best to repeat them into the microphone, and then Professor Ray can answer.
I guess it was very clear.
On Venezuela, does the recent conflict and loss of GDP, would you predict a civil war there because of changes between various groups in Venezuela?
Right. Shall we take more?
Because they're recording, so I think I need to repeat them.
Go for it.
So the question was about whether the sudden drop in GDP in Venezuela should be expected to lead to severe civil conflict.
Shall I answer? Or? Yeah.
So,
So, no, I thought we would wait for more. So it's not just Venezuela. If there is one other correlate of conflict I actually didn't show you, which is extremely strong, which is that GDP overall going up in the long run has reduced effects on conflict. Okay? It brings conflict down. The short-run movements in GDP are much more difficult to figure out. Like the Venezuelan example is one of them, right? A short-run drop in GDP in that case increased conflict. In India, short-run increases in GDP have increased conflict. If you look at Colombia, then you get both the stories of Venezuela and India told together in the following sense. If you look at the oil boom in Colombia, which happened during one of the periods when oil prices were rising, it actually increased conflict. If you look at the coffee boom in Colombia, which also happened around the same time and increased GDP, it reduced conflict. Okay? Now, the broad idea, I think, is the following, that a change in income has two effects. One is that it increases the amount of loot to be grabbed, just very broadly speaking. And the other is that it affects the opportunity cost of participating in violence. Right? When the former effect dominates the latter, then an increase in GDP may be violence-inducing, which is how I started this talk, right? That high rates of uneven growth may be violence-inducing. But when the latter effect dominates, namely the opportunity cost effect, then you get what happens in Venezuela. If there's a sudden drop in GDP, right? Let's say in sub-Saharan Africa because of a drought, or Venezuela, or in the case of the inverse of the coffee boom, you're actually going to get an increase in violence because the opportunity cost of engaging in it comes down. Did that make sense? Or you're looking at me very grimly there. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question that you may wish to comment on. I can see the economic argument. If you look at Rwanda, would you be able to comment or speculate on some thinking around the link between economics and ethnicity? Right. Sudan, I could see, for example, your argument, but Rwanda puzzles me.
So the question is about Rwanda in particular, about links between economics and ethnicity in that case.
Right. So actually, if you look at, there's a book by Gérard Trunier on Rwanda, which I don't know whether you've read, but the paper that I would like you to read is a paper by Catherine André and Jean-Philippe Plateau. And that paper talks about the entire history of violence in Rwanda as a massive land grab. Okay. So they document land grabbing on a massive scale, also cattle grabbing, but land grabbing especially, during the period of violence. Now, this is not to suggest that this was the only reason for violence, right? But there's a strong economic accompaniment to it. Sudan, of course, we agree on that.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the way you brought ethnicity into it. And it really got me thinking rethinking a number of my assumptions. But at the beginning, when you're talking about kind of, you're talking about class, and you're using income as your way of measuring class. And I'm wondering, in a lot of these situations, is income the best measure of class, or is class more of a kind of a constructed identity? And I'm thinking in terms of around Bengal, for example, the Badrullah, for example, who, are they really a class, or is their frustration due to the fact, is it due to the ethnicity, or is it due to a perceived drop in class that income may not measure?
Right.
So the question is whether income is a good measure of class and if other factors might not be important.
So my reaction to that would be that income differences perhaps are a necessary condition for class differences, but they're certainly not a sufficient condition for class differences. Yeah. So if you view things from that perspective, then the theory that I was talking about really has a much more specific prediction, which says not only do people who are similar in income should they engage. Sorry, let me say that again. It's not enough to say that people who have similar incomes should engage in violence, but people who are engaged in similar occupations and have similar incomes, right? So the theory is much more specific than what I've actually made it out to be. I've said people who are economically similar should engage in violence. You're saying no, because economic similarity is not a full definition of class. It could be that some of these people are fishermen, some of these people are working in the industrial sector. They may happen to have similar incomes, okay, but they're not in the same class group, which is a much broader construct, right? So as a result of that, this theory would suggest, no, that it's fishermen who would engage in violence with fishermen, and people in the textile industry would engage in violence with people in the textile industry. But the data that I have here is too broad to actually bring that particular prediction to the forefront. Yeah.
Yep.
I was thinking that if you take it beyond ethnic groups, consider taxi drivers and Uber drivers. Could the theory be extended there, and could you link it to how well protected is the tax community in a given area, because this will relate to their income? And I was thinking the recent story between taxi drivers and Uber in London.
So the questions about relating the discussions of today to taxi versus Uber drivers.
I think I can sense what your answer to that would be, and I think the answer is yes, right? So here are people in a similar occupational group, right? The marker is being clearly created Uber versus non-Uber, right? Of course, it's more complicated than that, right? Because these guys are engaged in different forms of economic organizations. It's far more complicated. But it's all a question of exclusion and therefore raising rents. Yeah? Now, whether the particular London ban on Uber is something that I would agree with or not, I don't know, because there's lots of other issues, right, on whether Uber drivers are properly vetted, whether criminal activity among Uber drivers is high or not, like Sadiq Khan has talked about, so I don't know. But it would be an a priori suspect, I would, for applying this theory.
There was a question here, yeah.
So how do you stop it? If you're in a country and you're going towards a place where you have more fractionalization, more polarization, what kind of policies can you have that says, okay, that ensures that there won't be any violence?
So the question is, what would be policy remedies against civil conflict?
Your question is an excellent one, and I've thought about it. Okay, so let's leave out the polarization and fractionalization bit. Let's say the ethnic composition is more or less given, which is not true, right? People can be driven out and so forth. But what's even a sharper way of posing your question is you could say, Debraj, you just showed me that Muslim incomes going up is violence inducing. What do you want to do? You want Muslim incomes not to go up, right? And of course, that's a deep conundrum. Obviously, I want Muslim incomes to go up, right? So there's an even sharper way of putting your question, right? Which is that good things in society for some groups can give rise to antagonism. And how do we deal with it? The answer is, I don't know. But I'll just give you a sharper way of putting it.
So, yep.
I have one. Just I'm concerned about kind of that you're leaving the elites out of the whole discussion in some way. They're providing resources, they're giving incentives for people to behave in a certain way, and there's rewards that they're gleaning from this conflict, potentially that aren't economic but are political, etc. And I wonder, isn't part of the problem in the context that you haven't spent much time discussing how context changes, but is whether there is a group of elites who are supporting civic institutions, state building, etc., which don't run along ethnic lines, and then provide rewards and incentives for people to align towards those institutions rather than along ethnic lines. And I wonder if there's some way to pick that up and try to control for that. Because some of these measures are pretty constant across, like India, the amount of fragmentation, the number of different groups, etc., is pretty constant. So what's changing in the background in terms of the role of the state, the support of elites for the state, and they're in the era of globalization, their withdrawal and leaving the situation to just disintegrate.
So the question is whether the role of elites should be explored further, especially with respect to their support or not for state institutions.
Right. Actually, there's several components to your question. Let me get the last bit out of the way, which is that there's so little variation in polarization, fractionalization, as you pointed out, and that also points to one of the drawbacks of this sort of regression, which is it's cross-sectional, right? It's not a panel. We are not living off a panel. We're just living off the cross-section variation, which is a drawback of this sort of regression. Now, as to the question of whether elites would support ethnicity-free secular institutions or whether they would engage in ethnic divisions through their own activity, I think the answer is complicated. There is a paper I have from a few years ago in the American Economic Review where we talk about elite diversions using ethnic conflict as a way of sidestepping the possibility of class conflict. And so sometimes ethnicity may be used as a tool to avoid income-based conflict. Now, that raises the deep question of why do these masses, the humble masses, obediently go along with whatever crumb is being thrown to them by the elite, right? And the point of that paper is to show, in the context of a strategic model, that sometimes it may be in the interest of the masses also to get divided up along ethnic lines. But the short answer to your question is that I'm not sure that the elite always go along the secular path rather than taking advantage of the religious.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut things off here, but so if you do have questions for Professor Ray, you're welcome to join us at the reception in the Environment 1 courtyard. So now I'd like to invite Tony Lamantia, who's not only a Waterloo alum, but also President and CEO of the Waterloo Economic Development Corporation, and he'll be closing up the lecture for us.
All right, many thanks, Jean-Guillaume. I always like stepping out of what I call the submarine of day-to-day work and listening to these types of talks because, they keep me thinking for weeks on end about not only the work we do, but how it fits into, social and economic life around the world. So I'm just going to start by saying I was able to spend some time with Debraj at lunch, and he's definitely a very humble, funny, and insightful gentleman. This was a great talk, so very well done. The Waterloo Arts Distinguished Lecturer in Economics educates students and the local community about economics and its impact on Canadians. It's certainly true that economic literacy gives business leaders the tools for understanding their world and how to interpret events that will either directly or indirectly affect their businesses and the communities in which they live. As the President and CEO of Waterloo EDC, I absolutely support collaborative efforts that generate economic prosperity for the region, and I really appreciate the opportunity to hear leading experts in the field who elevate our thinking about topical subjects. Again, I love stepping out of the submarine. So I want to thank Debraj for challenging all of us to think about the impact that inequality and social conflict can have on developing countries. I think each of us is going to think more carefully about the use of the words fractured and polarized, whether it's in connection with a conversation about NAFTA or international trade. And finally, I want to thank the Faculty of Arts and the Economics Department for deepening our understanding of economics and its impact on society. Great talk. Many thanks again, Debraj.